Stop. Don't rush past this. What you are about to hear will forever strip the shine from the portraits of your favorite movie idols. You believed in their pure-blooded nobility, but it was all a colossal lie. These 10 Hollywood legends were panic-stricken by their Jewish blood and for years betrayed their own parents for the sake of fame. They changed their names like dirty laundry and scorched their roots to the ground just to avoid being tossed out of the frame as unworthy. Today we will tear the masks off those who were ashamed of their origins and built their careers on a foundation of fear and cowardice. Prepare to see the true faces of idols who traded their conscience for a ticket into high society. And before we begin with the first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
Edward G. Robinson. Before you stands a man who became an icon of American cinema, creating an image that made the entire criminal underworld tremble. Edward G. Robinson. His Little Caesar turned him into a living legend, a symbol of unbreakable will and raw brutality. But few knew that behind the mask of the hard man, grinding his words through clenched teeth, lived someone gripped by a deadly, paralyzing fear. His entire career was built on a grand deception, on an attempt to flee from himself and erase from the world's memory the name with which he entered this life. His name was Emanuel Halpern. He was a Jewish boy from Bucharest, the son of immigrants, who learned Hollywood's central lesson early on. If you want to survive and dominate, you must kill the outsider within yourself. This is the story of a man who became king of the screen, yet lived his entire life as a fugitive, ashamed of his own blood and terrified that the dirty scent of immigrant neighborhoods would one day betray his true nature. Emanuel Halpern arrived in America at the age of 10, and this move was not the beginning of freedom, but an initiation into a world where his origins were a brand burned into the skin. In those days, anti-Semitism in the United States was not hidden. It was part of everyday life, a social norm that brutally limited the prospects of anyone who did not fit the standard of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Emanuel saw his people humiliated, locked into ghettos, barred from the doors of prestigious institutions. He was too intelligent to simply accept it, and too ambitious to remain in the shadows. The decision was swift and merciless. Emanuel Halpern had to die so that Edward G. Robinson could be born. The letter G in the middle of the name was the only thing left of his past, a faint trace of the surname Grunwald, his mother's family name. It was his first act of betrayal, his first deal with Hollywood's devil. Once he became Robinson, he began methodically destroying everything in himself that might hint at Jewish origins. He worked on his pronunciation, erasing the slightest trace of an accent. He studied the manners of high society and collected works of art with the fanaticism of a man desperate to prove his own civilization. Yet fate's irony was that Hollywood found its perfect use for him in gangster roles, men outside the law, rejected and dangerous. Robinson played them with such ferocity because, on a subconscious level, he understood that he himself was the same kind of outsider in the system, someone who had illegally clawed his way to the top. His Rico in Little Caesar was not just a character, it was a manifesto of a man ready to tear out throats just to be acknowledged. But the higher he rose, the stronger his fear became. Robinson lived in a gilded cage of his own making, dreading the day when studio bosses or influential anti-Semitic groups would point a finger at him and shout his real name. Robinson's most terrifying betrayal lay in his silence. In the 1930s, as Nazism was raising its head in Europe and Hollywood itself teemed with blacklists and secret leagues of haters, Edward G. Robinson did everything possible to avoid being associated with Jewish resistance. He terrified that any public defense of his own people would be labeled a Jewish conspiracy and destroy his career. He donated money to charity, but did so quietly, almost anonymously, afraid of provoking the wrath of Warner Brothers. His public image was of a 100% American, a patriot and an intellectual. He became a hostage to his own image of the gentleman gangster, forced to play by the rules of an industry that despised his roots. Imagine that level of psychological pressure, stepping onto the set every day, smiling at people who call your people filth behind your back, while knowing that you are one of them, yet too afraid to speak. The final act of this tragedy came when Robinson was targeted for his alleged communist sympathies during the era of McCarthyism. His loyalty was questioned, and his old fears surged back with renewed force. The system he had served by betraying himself turned against him. He was forced to justify himself, to prove his purity and devotion to American ideals. In that moment, Robinson understood that all his camouflage had been in vain. To those in power, he remained a suspicious element, an immigrant who tried too hard to belong. He died without ever fully and openly claiming his origins with pride. He is remembered as a great actor, but to history he stands as a symbol of a man who bought success at the price of rejecting his own identity. Edward G. Robinson was the first to show that in Hollywood you can become a god, but only after killing the human being within and betraying the memory of your ancestors.
Kirk Douglas. Before you stands Kirk Douglas, the indomitable Spartacus, a hero of westerns, the embodiment of absolute masculine power and fearlessness. Yet behind that dazzling Hollywood macho facade lay a shameful secret he spent decades trying to cauterize out of his life. The man who on screen led legions of slaves into battle for freedom was, in reality, a slave to his own fear and burning shame over his origins. His name was not Kirk. His name was Isur Danilovich. He was the son of a penniless, illiterate ragman from a forgotten backwater, a Jewish immigrant barely scraping by. And Isur Danilovich hated his name, his home, and his blood so fiercely that he would have erased them from human history if it meant becoming a real American. This is the story of a monumental act of cowardice wrapped in a gladiator's armor. Douglas did not simply change his surname for the sake of a career. He performed a ritual murder of his own identity, terrified that the dirty origins of a ragman's son would slam shut the doors to luxury and limelight. Isur grew up in crushing poverty amid the harsh anti-Semitism of American outskirts, and instead of taking pride in his people's endurance, he chose the path of the chameleon. His first step toward fame was the total annihilation of anything that might recall the Jewish shtetl. He trained his voice to exhaustion to erase even a hint of Yiddish intonation, altered his gait, rewrote his own biography. He arrived in Hollywood already reborn as Kirk Douglas, an immaculate product without a past, a man without lineage. While his people in Europe were passing through the hell of the Holocaust, Kirk Douglas basked in sunny Hollywood, playing romantic heroes and valiant soldiers, gripped by panic that someone might uncover his real name. He lived in constant tension, fearing that one day a destitute relative would appear at the gates of his mansion and collapse this house of cards built on lies. To admit his Jewishness in the 1940s and 50s would have meant signing his own sentence, and he chose betrayal. He pointedly ignored Jewish traditions, distanced himself from the community, did everything he could to be seen as a white Anglo-Saxon. This was more than a hunger for fame. It was a pathological terror of being deemed subhuman in the eyes of studio bosses. Even after he became a superstar and a millionaire, Even when he turned producer and could dictate terms, Kirk kept playing the role. His Spartacus stood as a symbol of rebellion, yet Douglas himself never rebelled against the system that forced him to hide his essence. He was part of that system, its loyal guard dog, protecting his own myth. Whispers circulated in the industry that his on-screen manliness was nothing more than overcompensation for the dread that seized him whenever someone mentioned his father, the ragman. He despised his own weakness and kept on lying. Only in the twilight of his life, when hiding the truth had become pointless and the old Hollywood guard had faded into oblivion, did Douglas begin to speak publicly of Isur Danilovich. But this late repentance looked pitiful against decades of silence and renunciation. He lived as the great Kirk Douglas, yet died knowing that all his greatness was built on cowardice before his own blood. He proved to the world that one could conquer Rome on screen while remaining a deeply unhappy man who never dared to be himself. It was the tragedy of a golden boy who sold his soul and his ancestral memory for the right to smile from magazine covers, forever a hostage to his false name.
Lauren Bacall. Her low, fatal timbre and the famous icy look from beneath her brows, the look, made men freeze in rapture and drove Humphrey Bogart himself to abandon everything for this 20-year-old predator. She was the embodiment of American aristocracy, restraint, and that rare kind of elegance reserved for the chosen few. But behind the facade of the White Queen hid a truth that Warner Bros. Burned out of her biography with a red-hot iron, and that Lauren herself buried deeper than her most shameful secrets. Her name was Betty Joan Persky. She was the daughter of Jewish immigrants from Poland and Romania, flesh of the flesh of those impoverished Bronx neighborhoods Hollywood despised and dismissed as breeding grounds of misery. To become Lauren Bacall, this 19-year-old girl committed a cold-blooded act of betrayal. She agreed to erase her surname, her faith, and her ancestors from the world's memory in exchange for a golden ticket to the top tier. This is the story of a woman who spent her entire life playing the role of an English rose, panic-stricken by the thought that one day her mother's Jewish accent might betray her, or that the truth about her close family ties to Shimon Peres might suddenly surface. Bacall didn't simply change her name. She put on a mask of icy indifference toward her own people, becoming one of the great mystifications of the Golden Age, built on total renunciation. The studio bosses, themselves Jewish and fully aware of the poison of American anti-Semitism, told her bluntly, "With the name Persky, you'll only ever play grocery cashiers or maids in the houses of real stars." And Betty Joan Persky, without blinking, carried out a ritual murder of her identity. She took her mother's maiden name, Weinstein Bacall, mutilated it into the more Nordic-sounding Bacall, and began methodically reshaping her nature the way a surgeon reshapes a face. For hours on end, until her vocal cords were raw and bleeding, she trained her voice, forcing it down into an unnaturally low, almost masculine register, so she would sound like a purebred American woman from closed country clubs, with only the right blood in her veins. In Hollywood, she lived like a deep-cover spy behind enemy lines. Even after she became Bogart's wife, the nation's ultimate hero, she continued to play her most difficult role. She was sick with fear, nauseated by the thought that her new intellectual friends from Washington's elite might discover her ignoble origins. While her people in Europe were drowning in blood and struggling to survive the aftermath of the Holocaust, Lauren Bacall dazzled on glossy magazine covers, carefully concealing her ties to New York's Jewish community. It was a life lived in constant terror of exposure, where every dinner party felt like a silent interrogation, and any casual question about roots made her heart seize with horror. She was a style icon built on a foundation of total falsehood. Bacall deliberately distanced herself from anything that might reveal the daughter of Persky beneath the polish.
She created an image of cold, untouchable perfection because she knew that any crack in that armor would turn her into a laughingstock in the anti-Semitic society of the 1940s. Even after becoming Bogart's wife and wielding enormous influence, she did not rush to tell the truth. In her memoirs, written decades later, she clumsily tried to justify herself with references to the difficulty of the times and contractual obligations. But the truth was simpler and harsher. Bacall chose comfort, diamonds, and acclaim over honesty and loyalty to her home. She was willing to let her family and her history remain in the shadows, so long as her own glow was not dimmed by the wrong kind of shadow. The independence millions of women around the world admired was a complete illusion. She was utterly dependent on the opinions of studio bosses and on her own paranoid fear of anti-Semitic attacks. Even during the witch hunts of the 1950s, when many Jews in Hollywood came under fire, Bacall continued her game of hide-and-seek with her conscience, sheltering behind her husband's famous name. She became a towering legend, but carried the crushing weight of that voluntary, cowardly renunciation to the end of her days. Lauren Bacall proved that it is possible to become a great actress by completely eradicating the human core within oneself. Yet in every mirror she saw, to her dying breath, that same frightened little girl, Betty Persky, who sold her history, her faith, and her name for the right to be called the Ice Queen of the screen. It was a cold, calculated bargain with conscience, paid for with an entire lifetime lived under another flag, and behind a borrowed face she never dared to show the world without a mask.
Tony Curtis. Before you stands the man whose face in the 1950s was considered the gold standard of male beauty, Tony Curtis. His ducktail haircut became a cultural obsession, his gaze made women swoon, and his pairing with Marilyn Monroe in Some Like It Hot sealed his place in history as Hollywood's ultimate playboy. Yet behind that blinding smile and sculpted body hid a personality steeped in burning shame over his origins. His name was Bernard Schwartz. He was the son of impoverished Jewish immigrants from Hungary, raised in the stinking slums of the Bronx, where every day was a fight for survival. Bernie Schwartz loathed the smell of cabbage in his tenement hallway, loathed his parents' poverty, and above all loathed his name, which sounded to him like a sentence to eternal obscurity. To become Tony Curtis, this man committed one of the most cynical betrayals in Hollywood history. He didn't merely change his surname, he methodically and coldly purged everything Jewish from himself, turning him into a polished puppet of Universal Studios. This is the story of a man who sold his blood and his ancestral memory for a seat in the front row at Beverly Hills parties, living in constant terror that the accent of a ghetto street kid would one day give him away. Bernard Schwartz understood the rules of the game from the very beginning. In a world ruled by white Protestants, a guy named Schwartz had no future. He watched how studio bosses looked at their own, those with the right pedigree and the right manners, and decided he would become more American than the Americans themselves. He took the name Anthony Curtis, inspired by novels about aristocrats, and began his transformation. He spent hours erasing Yiddish inflections from his speech, reshaping his movements, learning to wear suits as if he had been born in them. But the most repulsive part was how he distanced himself from his family. To Tony Curtis, his parents were a living reminder of who he really was, a miserable immigrant, and he did everything possible to keep that part of his life buried deep in shadow. He played knights, heroes, and seducers, while living under constant, exhausting stress that Bernie Schwartz's dirty past would resurface and destroy his career. He was terrified of the anti-Semitic undercurrents thriving in the industry at the time, and instead of standing with his own, he chose total assimilation bordering on betrayal. His life became an endless performance, not only on set, but in his own bedroom, where he never allowed himself a single moment of rest. Tony Curtis was willing to endure any humiliation as long as the studio didn't tear up his contract over his wrong blood. He became a symbol of success, yet inside remained the same frightened Bronx boy, terrified of being exposed. His many marriages, including his union with icon Janet Leigh, were part of this grand camouflage. He constructed the image of a perfect American family, so no one would dare suspect he was an outsider. He spent millions on a lavish lifestyle, trying to drown out the voice of conscience reminding him of the roots he had betrayed. Even when times changed and Jewishness in Hollywood ceased to be a verdict, Curtis clung to his false image, afraid of losing the last traces of the gloss he had gained by killing Bernard Schwartz within himself. This was the tragedy of a man who achieved everything he dreamed of and lost himself in the process. He became a legend, but the price of that legend was total moral bankruptcy and a life lived in perpetual flight from his own reflection. Tony Curtis proved that one could conquer Hollywood as the most beautiful man on the planet and still remain a slave to shame, a man without a homeland who traded his father's name for the cheap applause of the crowd. In his eyes, until the very end, lingered the fear that one day the spotlights would go dark and the world would see not a screen idol, but that same impoverished Bernie who never dared to become a man in real life.
Paulette Goddard. Before you stands a woman who was not merely an actress, but the coldest puppet master of Hollywood's golden age, Paulette Goddard. She was the muse of the brilliant Charlie Chaplin, the wife of the great Eric Maria Remarque, and the leading contender for the role of Scarlett O'Hara until she was thrown out of the project over her dubious reputation. She was called the most vibrant, daring, and electric woman in the film industry, the embodiment of adventure and untamed glamour. Yet her dazzling public life was a grand, mathematically precise fabrication, a stage set behind which she hid her wrong blood with the cruelty of a seasoned executioner. Her real name was Pauline Levy. She was the daughter of Joseph Levy, and in her veins flowed the very Jewish blood that Hollywood of the 1930s considered toxic ballast, capable of sinking any career. Paulette Goddard didn't simply change her name for elegance, she carried out an ideological purge of her own biography, effectively killing her father in official records and in public memory. This is the story of a woman who built an empire on a foundation of total lies, manipulating some of the greatest minds of her time so that no one would ever guess that the brilliant Paulette was nothing more than a frightened Jewish girl who fled the wreckage of her identity for diamonds, sable coats, and power. From the very beginning of her career in the chorus line, she understood one thing clearly. In a world ruled by money and prejudice, a product bearing the name Levy would never sell at the highest price. She took her mother's maiden name, Goddard, and wrapped herself in a dense fog of mystery, deliberately confusing journalists, biographers, and even her own husbands. When pressed with questions about her origins, she lied with such virtuosity that she began to believe her own fantasies about aristocratic roots and mixed blood. Paulette coldly and demonstratively distanced herself from the Jewish community, ignoring the tragedies of her people, even while working with Chaplin on The Great Dictator. In that film, a manifesto against Hitler, she played Hannah, a Jewish girl, and this was the peak of her cynicism, portraying a victim of anti-Semitism on screen, while in real life she hid her own Jewishness in sheer terror behind the camera. She used her looks and a razor-sharp mind to break into the most closed circles of high society, where anti-Semitic jokes at the dinner table were the norm, and she smiled along, terrified that the slightest tremor of her hands might betray her.
Her life was an endless masquerade in which powerful men and lavish mansions changed, but the mask of the white American woman, for whom the past was nothing but a torn-out blank page, never came off. Goddard was ready for any betrayal to preserve her status and access to power. She collected jewels with a manic greed, as if trying to literally buy off her conscience and her origins with mountains of gold. She was called the smartest woman in cinema, but all of her intelligence was focused on one thing alone: survival in a system that did not forgive truth. She knew that a single admission of her kinship with Joseph Levy would turn her image of an exotic beauty to dust and slam the doors of elite clubs shut forever. She was a chameleon, changing skin tone and political views depending on who sat across from her: an all-powerful producer, a millionaire husband, or a fashionable racist. Even when ethnic openness became fashionable in Hollywood, Paulette continued her game of hide-and-seek, carrying her shameful secrets to the grave in Switzerland, as far away as possible from Brooklyn and her real roots. She became a legend, but the price of that legend was a complete loss of connection to reality and to her own family, which she traded for the cold glitter of the spotlights. Paulette Goddard proved that one can be a muse to geniuses and an icon of global style while remaining the greatest liar of the century. A woman who chose sparkling stones over the warmth of her own blood. It was the tragedy of a woman so terrified of being deemed unworthy in the eyes of strangers that she sentenced herself to a lifetime of solitude under a Chujoya invented name.
Sammy Davis Jr. He sang in a way that stole the breath from his audience. He danced as if gravity had no claim on him. He played dozens of instruments with the virtuosity of a born genius. Even Frank Sinatra himself, the uncrowned king of America, publicly admitted that Sammy was the only man who surpassed him in sheer talent. Yet behind this manic whirlwind of stage energy, behind the endless barrage of jokes and the blinding, toothy smile, lay a fate far closer to prolonged psychological torture and solitary confinement than to the life of a global superstar. Sammy Davis Jr. was an African American in the era of Jim Crow laws, when in the United States the color of your skin dictated every movement you made, which door you were allowed to enter, which restroom you could use, which chipped water fountain you were permitted to drink from. But for Sammy, that humiliation was not enough. In the mid-1950s, he committed an act that detonated the minds of conservative America and sent shockwaves through Hollywood itself. He officially converted to Judaism. In a world that already hated him for his skin color, he consciously and deliberately painted a second target on his own back. This is the story of a man who desperately sought salvation and spiritual ground in the faith of a people who themselves had lived for centuries in exile and oppression, only to find himself crushed between the red-hot hammer of racism and the icy anvil of anti-Semitism. Sammy sincerely believed that religion would give him the moral footing stripped from him by white Protestant America, but cynical Hollywood instantly turned his sacred spiritual choice into yet another freak show, an exotic circus act. He was expected to be a convenient Jew, a performing accessory for white studio bosses who behind closed doors called him the filthiest names imaginable. His path to the Torah began in 1954 after a horrific car accident in which he nearly died and permanently lost his left eye. Lying in a hospital bed, wrapped in bandages, and paralyzed by fear for his career, he frantically searched for meaning and found it in the story of Jewish survival, drawing direct parallels to the centuries-long suffering of black slaves on American plantations. But Hollywood, that colossus with feet of clay, built by Jewish moguls who themselves had spent decades mutilating their own lives by changing surnames and burying immigrant relatives in the basements of history, met Sammy's choice with icy contempt and venomous mockery. To the studio power brokers, he became
too complex and too dangerous a product, difficult to sell to the small-town consumer. Sammy Davis Jr. found himself in a situation of pure absurdity. He wore a gold Star of David on his chest with pride, while his colleagues, the very influential Jews discussed in earlier chapters, continued to tremble over their contracts, scrubbing their biographies clean of any hint of Jewishness. Sammy became a living, walking reproach to a cowardly Hollywood. He spoke openly about his new identity, while others hid behind pseudonyms and Anglo-Saxon manners. But the price of that defiance was brutal and relentless. He was still barred from the same luxury Las Vegas hotels where he sold out shows and generated millions in profit for the owners. He was forced to enter buildings through foul-smelling service entrances, and in dressing rooms, the same people who had just embraced him on stage under the flash of cameras cracked nauseating jokes about the black kike. It was a level of psychological violence so extreme that Sammy had to squeeze a smile out of himself every second in front of his tormentors just to preserve his right to step into the spotlight. He became a hostage to his own double identity, accepted by no one. Sammy Davis Jr. tried to prove that genius has no color and no religion, but Hollywood's racist and anti-Semitic machinery snapped him in half again and again. When he married the blonde Swedish actress May Britt, a ferocious wave of hatred crashed down on him from all sides. Ku Klux Klan members cursed him for defiling the white race, while religious hardliners condemned him for violating every conceivable canon. Sammy lived in a constant, unrelenting hell of self-justification, trying to be black enough for the civil rights struggle and one of us for the white Jewish elite who still saw him nothing more than a gifted jester. The truth was that he remained profoundly alone, a despised outcast in this glittering world of fake smiles. His explosive stage energy was nothing less than a silent scream of despair from a man who never managed to find a home in any community on Earth. Sammy Davis Jr. proved by his own life that in Hollywood you can be a god of the stage and a universally recognized genius, but if you dare to be honest about your faith and your roots, the industry will drain you dry and leave you to die alone on the roadside of life. This was the tragedy of a man who found the courage to wear a kippah where everyone else wore cowardly masks and paid for that sacred defiance with a scorched soul and a shattered heart.
Hedy Lamarr. When she appeared on screen, audiences forgot how to breathe, and producers counted their millions, exploiting her flawless profile and languid gaze. But behind that blinding, almost divine beauty lay one of the most tragic and fiercely guarded secrets of the Golden Age. Her real name was Hedwig Eva Maria Kiesler. She was a Jewish girl from Vienna, the daughter of a banker, forced to flee the Nazi boot as it marched across Europe. Hollywood welcomed her with open arms and a brutal condition. You must kill Hedwig Kiesler within yourself. Forget your language, your faith, your history. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, personally invented the name Lamarr and ordered her never to speak of her origins, remaking her into a rootless, exotic Austrian. This is the story of a woman whose brilliant mind laid the foundations of modern Wi-Fi and mobile communication, yet whose voice was smothered in Hollywood's silks and diamonds, an industry that saw only expensive flesh for box office returns and panicked at the thought of her Jewish past. Hedy Lamarr lived in a state of absolute cognitive dissonance. While her people in Europe were burned in ovens and shot in ravines, she was forced to play empty seductresses, Samsons and Delilahs, offering nothing but skin and hair. MGM built a vacuum around her. She was forbidden to publicly associate with Jewish organizations. Her dates were arranged, her small talk scripted. Hedy was far too intelligent for this degenerate industry. At night, instead of drinking cocktails at parties, she locked herself in her lab and designed secure communication systems to fight Hitler. When she brought her inventions to the American government, they laughed in her face and advised her to do something more useful.
Sell those war bonds with that pretty face of yours. It was humiliation beyond measure. A Jewish genius and inventor was ordered to play a foolish doll so as not to irritate the anti-Semitic segment of the audience or tarnish the studio's image. She became a hostage to her own face, a golden mask that concealed constant pain and terror for the loved ones trapped in the hell of occupied Europe. Her personal life collapsed under the weight of this enforced silence. 6 marriages, endless scandals, and attempts to numb herself with prescription drugs were the price of never being allowed to be herself. She hated Hollywood for castrating her identity and leaving only a shell. She was terrified of aging, knowing that the moment her beauty faded, the industry would discard her like trash. Her mind and her roots had never mattered. And so it happened. The great Hedy Lamarr ended her days in poverty and oblivion, a recluse and a victim of failed plastic surgeries. Until her final breath, she carried resentment toward a world that used her body, despised her blood, and ignored her genius. Hedy Lamarr proved that in the Golden Age, even the status of a goddess did not protect you from humiliation if you were born with the wrong surname and an intellect too sharp. She died alone, leaving the world the technologies of the future for which she was never paid a cent in her lifetime, and a wounded soul Hollywood trampled for the sake of a beautiful image on a poster.
Judy Garland. Before you stands America's natural treasure, the girl who made the entire world believe that somewhere over the rainbow there was happiness. Judy Garland. Yet behind her angelic voice and Dorothy's wide, trusting eyes lay one of the darkest tragedies in the history of show business. Frances Ethel Gumm, that was her real name. And although her origins were shrouded in ambiguity, she became the ultimate hostage of a system built by Jewish moguls who themselves lived in a state of profound psychological fracture and self-loathing toward their own roots. Louis B. Mayer and the leadership of MGM constructed a perfect Protestant myth for white America, and Judy was chosen to play the role of the ideal Christian girl, a symbol of purity and innocence. The irony was monstrous. A child from a family with deep, carefully concealed connections was thrown into the meat grinder of an industry run by men who were terrified of appearing too Jewish. To force Judy into their fabricated ideal, they fed her drugs, starved her, and trained her to despise her own nature. This is the story of how Hollywood drained the life from a living human being, turning her into a soulless instrument for selling American values that its creators secretly despised. Judy Garland lived at the epicenter of Jewish Hollywood, but it was a world that had castrated itself for profit. Mayer and his inner circle were self-hating Jews who built a glossy on-screen universe with no room for Judaism, immigrant pain, or reality itself. And Judy became their primary puppet. She was forbidden to display any individuality that didn't fit the image of the girl next door. They forced her to alter her appearance, bind her chest, and survive on a diet of black coffee and cigarettes so she could remain that sexless angel singing about rainbows. While behind the scenes producers discussed box office numbers in Yiddish, on screen she was required to embody the dream of the white middle class. The hypocrisy was staggering. Hollywood's Jewish elite exploited Judy Garland's talent to sell a counterfeit American Idol, completely indifferent to how this lie was shattering the actress's psyche. Judy was surrounded by people ashamed of their own origins, and that virus of shame infected her as well. She spent her entire life feeling not good enough, ugly, and fundamentally unworthy, because that was how those who saw her only as a cash cow treated her. Her repeated breakdowns, emotional collapses, and chemical dependence were the direct result of life inside this total falsehood.
Judy Garland was forced to betray her true self every time the red camera light turned on. She watched her mentors and bosses renounce their names and families for success, and she absorbed the lesson: to be yourself is to lose. Her entire life became an endless performance of obedience to tyrants who built an emerald city on a foundation of fear and denial. Garland died at 47, exhausted, broken, and driven to the edge by a system that used her as a shield against reality. She became an icon, but the cost was the complete destruction of her identity. She was a singer whose voice trembled with the uncried tears of an entire generation of people who agreed to live under borrowed names and borrowed masks. Judy Garland proved that Hollywood can turn you into a deity, but only after it guts your soul and teaches you to feel shame for every breath not written into the script of an ideal life. This was the tragedy of a golden girl who never found her way home, because those meant to guide her had long since forgotten where they themselves came from.
Claude Rains. You remember him as the cynical Captain Renault from Casablanca, the mad scientist in The Invisible Man, or the calculating villain in Hitchcock's films. He was a master of nuance, the king of supporting roles, an actor whose very presence instantly elevated the stature of any picture. Yet behind that impeccable English pronunciation, behind the elegant suits and lordly manners, lay a truth Rains guarded with paranoid ferocity. His entire life was the greatest performance of all, the concealment of his own essence. Claude Rains was a carefully constructed project designed to bury Claude William Rains, the son of immigrants with deep Jewish roots raised in the slums of London. This is the story of a man who became an invisible man not only on screen but in life itself, voluntarily castrating his identity to fit into the world of the white elite, which despised everything connected to his real past. He didn't merely change his image, he carried out a total reprogramming of his personality, living in terror that one day an intonation or a gesture from the Jewish quarters he had fled might betray him. Rains began his career with what was considered a fatal flaw, a harsh Cockney accent and a speech defect that, in Britain of that era, marked a person as irredeemably lower class. But to him, that was only half the problem. His real ballast in his own mind was his blood. He saw how Hollywood and London treated Jews as talented but dirty operators who would never be allowed to play kings or gentlemen. And so Rains made a decision. He would become more British than the king himself. He forged his famous voice, cold, precise, stripped of overt emotion, as a kind of armor through which the truth of his origins could never seep. In Hollywood, he became the perfect English import. Studio bosses adored him, precisely because, unlike openly Jewish actors, he caused no trouble with his background. Rains lived in a state of permanent psychological camouflage. While his people in Europe were being methodically exterminated, he played imperial officers and sophisticated social lions, never once raising his voice in defense of his own. It was the silence of a lamb wearing a wolf's skin so as not to be devoured. He feared anti-Semitic purges in the film industry with blind panic, and to preserve his status as an intellectual, was willing to consign his lineage to complete oblivion. His entire career was a hymn of hypocrisy. Rains married 6 times, and not one of his wives was ever able to penetrate the wall he had built around his past. He became a man without a home, without faith, without a face he could truly call his own. Every role was another brick in the barrier separating him from reality. He played the invisible man so convincingly that by the end of his life, he himself no longer knew where the actor ended and where the frightened boy from the slums began, the boy ashamed of his parents and his origins.
Claude Rains proved that one can achieve worldwide acclaim and become a legend if one is willing to turn life itself into a cold, calculated act of betrayal. He died, leaving behind dozens of brilliant performances, but not a single honest word about who he truly was. It was the tragedy of a genius who traded his heart for a flawless accent and the right to dine in restaurants his father would never have been allowed to enter. He became the great invisible man, seen by millions on screen, yet never truly known, because to his dying day he was terrified of what he might see if he looked into the mirror without the mask.
Mel Brooks, the great provocateur, the king of satire, the man who made the world laugh at things others were afraid to whisper about even in the dark. His real name was Melvin Kaminsky. He was born in Brooklyn to a family of Eastern European immigrants, and unlike all the cowardly stars we've discussed, he refused to kill the Kaminsky inside himself just to become palatable to Hollywood. Mel Brooks entered the industry at a time when fear of the wrong origins still saturated studio corridors, when actors were still changing their names and producers were still hiding their roots. But Brooks saw through all that hypocrisy, all that shameful camouflage, and decided to turn it into a grand farce. This is the story of a man who committed the most audacious act of the so-called Golden Age. He made anti-Semitism and Jewish fear the object of merciless laughter. He didn't merely acknowledge his origins, he turned them into his primary weapon, proving that the only way to defeat a monster is to expose it to ridicule. Brooks watched his colleagues, those endless Robinsons, Curtises, and Bacalls, live in constant paranoid tension, terrified of being exposed. He saw how Hollywood castrated talent by forcing people to be ashamed of their own blood, and his answer was the producers. To put on a show about Hitler in 1967, when the wounds of the Holocaust were still bleeding and Hollywood was doing everything it could to avoid the subject of Jewishness, was an act of staggering courage or sheer madness. Mel Brooks mocked not only Nazism, he mocked the industry itself, which had spent decades hiding behind masks. While others trembled for their careers, Brooks filled the screen with characters bearing unmistakably Jewish names and unmistakable mannerisms, hurling the truth straight into the face of an audience accustomed to sanitized heroes. He became the first to say it openly and without apology. Yes, I'm Jewish, and that's not a tragedy, that's my strength. He shattered the sacred terror surrounding anti-Semitism by showing that shame about one's origins is the greatest defeat of all. Mel Brooks became the final chapter in this chronicle of renunciation. He proved that you could keep your name, your accent, and the memory of your parents intact and still become a global superstar. His success was a slap in the face to everyone who had spent decades living under borrowed names, flinching at every sound. Brooks showed that Hollywood was not only a golden cage for cowards, but also a battlefield for those with the guts to be themselves. Behind his Homeric laughter and wild gags stood the deep wisdom of a man who understood one simple truth. Lies scorch the soul, while truth, no matter how dirty or inconvenient it may seem to the system, sets you free. Mel Brooks closed the era of invisibility and opened the door for a new generation that no longer had to murder its own identity for the sake of a contract. He survived this inferno of hypocrisy with his name and his conscience intact, delivering a final verdict on all the legends who chose the glare of spotlights over the warmth of home. It was the triumph of spirit
over fear. And today, Mel Brooks remains the last giant who remembers how Hollywood tried to erase an entire people from the screen, and how one small Kaminsky from Brooklyn refused to let that happen.
We have shown you 10 lives, 10 of the greatest talents who, at the peak of their power, remained pitiful hostages to their own fear. These are not merely stories about changing surnames. This is a chronicle of mass spiritual suicide committed at the very heart of the global film industry. Golden Age Hollywood was not a dream factory. It was a vast meat grinder that devoured identity, crushed bones, and spat out a sterile, soulless product seasoned with lies and makeup. All these legends you admired for decades were, in essence, spies in their own lives. They traded the right to call their fathers by name for the right to smile from magazine covers destined for tomorrow's trash bins. They built a world where being yourself was considered a crime, and where admitting your roots was tantamount to civil execution. This is the greatest tragedy in the history of art. People capable of making millions laugh and cry spent their own nights in tears, crushed by the knowledge of their own worthlessness and betrayal of their blood. Look at this list once more. Robinson, Douglas, Bacall, Lamarr. They became gods of the screen, but in reality they were wanderers without a homeland and without memory. They feared every rustle, every accidental mention of their true past, living in constant anticipation of a knife in the back from the very system they fed with their talent. And the most terrifying truth is that the system won. It forced them to believe they were wrong, that their heritage was dead weight, that their faith was a stain. You saw how only a few, people like Mel Brooks, found the strength to spit in the face of this hypocritical monster and openly claim their right to truth. The rest carried their shame to the grave, leaving us nothing but cold shadows on celluloid. This lesson must be learned by heart. The moment you agree to hide your essence for the sake of success, you cease to belong to yourself. You become property of the studio, property of the crowd, property of the lie. Let this film stand as a monument, not to their talent, but to their greatest mistake. Let it remind everyone that success built on the renunciation of the self always tastes of ash. We tore off the masks. We dragged into the light what they tried to bury beneath layers of gloss and diamonds. Now you know the truth, and this truth is the most devastating thing that could ever happen to the myth of Golden Hollywood. They wanted to be remembered as heroes, but we have shown you frightened people who traded their souls for a one-way ticket to an emerald city that never existed. Now the choice is yours, to keep believing the fairy tale or to accept this bitter reality. History does not forgive betrayal, and today we have delivered the final verdict on these legends.